Well, good morning, everyone. Afternoon, wherever you are. It's good to be with you again. We've been working on technical issues this morning, so hopefully we won't glitch ourselves along the way. But episode number 61, as we continue this whole discussion about spiritual abuse and authority, power, all that fun stuff. Kind of interesting. It's a pretty hot discussion that's going on out there in lots and lots of mediums of the world right now, and so we're just going to kind of jump into this. We left off last week with talking about how in the world do we develop or decide who decides, where is decided, the whole concept of the common good, and how does that affect us in the sense of what leadership and the power structures as they come together, how does that work in the church, and or is it not working, or is it being abused, or is it being ignored or taken advantage of? So pretty interesting. Mike and I've had a fair amount of personal experience with people who have taken upon themselves to move into places of power that has been fascinating to watch. And unfortunately, we've been the recipients of some of that not good.
Not unfortunately. No, fortunately, we have been the targets of that kind of use of power. I think it's great because it's put me in a place now for which my colleagues who remained behind have expressed anywhere from marginal discomfort to outright disdain of how they're treated as they get ready to retire, when they've been in a church for X number of years, up to many, and then all of a sudden they're just moved or released or retired forcibly. They really have no say. And when I left that denomination under some duress, in my mind, it wasn't a negative. And people use the word problem. They frame their own thinking as, I've encountered a problem or a blockage, and I say, no, you have an opportunity. Now this detour is going to open new possibilities for you. This is really good. But that's part of the optimism in me that takes challenging situations and I use language to frame them in a different light so that my mind can work on it as opposed to it stops me. But we end up with discussing one of the verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. Paul writes to the Corinthians, a very dysfunctional group of people. If you're all not readers of the Bible, you might have the idea that the Bible promotes itself and all of its heroes as flawless, golden, champion, heroic people who have halos around their head. That's depicted that way in church art. They really were not that way at all.
No.
And if you let the Bible speak for itself, read what's really there, not a verse at a time, but really understand what's being communicated, you realize these are ordinary folks who are in an extraordinary situation, and very, very frequently they had no idea what to do. So Paul is writing to the Corinthians, very dysfunctional group. They argued, they criticized each other, they used their power to manipulate, to drive people away that they didn't like. Even in the earliest days of the church, they determined what was a good church person and what was a bad church person. They didn't want the bad church people. They wanted only the good church people. And Paul writes them and says, the Holy Spirit has been given to you and it is manifest in you, made apparent, it's clear. And the phrase he turns there is for the common good. But then he doesn't explain what the common good is.
Right.
I was in a meeting with our local school superintendent today, a breakfast meeting with the Chamber of Commerce. And he was saying we are floating the idea of building a significant field house for our sports teams, music, on and on. And also the community can use it in the evening after school hours. But the problem is it's going to come with a tax increase of 150, 130 something dollars per 100,000. And the question is, how do we convince people that don't have kids in school that this is really a good thing for them? And I said, for the common good. And the superintendent, who's a Christian, reads the Bible. He turned to me and he goes, yeah, the common good. And I said, how do we determine the common good? He goes, that's the question. I don't know how to do that. And when it was, I knew we were going to be talking about that today. So it was kind of a setup to see what he would say if he says, we, the powers that run the school, we determine what is the common good, or it's good for us, so it's common good. Or how do we determine what is the common good if I don't personally benefit from whatever that is?
Right. Yeah. And that becomes very I think many times it becomes very arbitrary from the people who are in leadership or control. The dynamic of the balance of I would say of people having input in their lives that, and we're talking in the church sense here. Well, I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's whether it's a church or it's leadership in a company or whatever else. If all you do is bring people around you, which is the kind of modus operandi for organizations right now, bringing people who parrot back to you what you think and what you want, and are, if you will, pardon the expression, doing the party line, but not from the standpoint of challenging you when there's something that is, there truly is two different ways to look at this, or even, you and I have both seen where people will just cave because it's too much trouble, or they don't want to pay the price for what it'll cost if they stand up, and raise their hand and ask the real right questions. They just go, well, we'll work around that. And that has become very much a sense of how we operate. I think it starts at that level where people who are in place of power, place of, and I wouldn't say authority, because authority brings with it, in my mind, that whole context of where you have people speaking into your life who do not agree with you, but you love them anyway. I mean, it's like who was it? I'll probably get this wrong, but I know it was Chesterton, and was it Lewis and
who cares? What's the quote? What's the idea?
Tolkien, where, well, they'd be in huge conflict about theological issues and talking, and having these great discussions, and they would get done and they'd go to the pub and and have a beer and have a cigar together, and laugh and have a great time. They were great friends, but they weren't afraid to challenge each other in a way that made the other person have to really think.
But when the stakes don't apply, when you're talking about Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and some of those great minds, they were friends at Oxford University. Right. The problem is if C.S. Lewis says, I believe in A, and Tolkien says, well, I believe in B, that it's irrelevant to their normal daily life. They just are professors, and they teach and they write books and they do whatever they want to do. The question is, when the stakes are I can't continue my occupation.
Right.
I will get fired. I will
Right.
not have a job or healthcare benefits. I won't have a role. I don't have a title. I've been in this position, and somebody who has more power than I have determines B, and I say A. Now the stakes are gigantic.
Right.
And the person who fired you, let's say it was malicious, you're not going to go to the pub and have a beer and smoke a cigar with
No,
him.
I understand.
Right. So now the question arises, how is a common good determined? One of the things that was commented about moving me beyond that denomination circles was, this is for the common good. Meaning what? Well, the person who creates so much conflict is now not available to create that conflict. Because, well, I didn't create conflict.
Right.
In their opinion, the power people,
right.
I did create conflict by raising issues the leadership did not want raised. But the question is that for the common good to have opposing voices, or is it the common good not to have opposing voices? Who decides that?
Right. Right. Well, I think in our context of the church, you have to, I know I use the word have to. It's opening the scripture up again and looking at the role models and asking those questions in the context of how Jesus interacted and dealt with people across the board, because he's the ultimate aspect in this whole thing. I think you pointed out the other day when we were talking, I think this is a really good illustration of where we get so wound up with a mindset that is not meant to be in a common good, but is in a power structure. And that is, the whole issue of Matthew 18, of dealing with people who won't repent. And that's used all the time. It's rarely used correctly from the stand. If people actually read what is there,
there may be some people listening to this bizarre podcast who have no idea what Matthew 18 is. They have no clue. We just lost.
So give them a quick overview.
In Matthew 18, there's only 3 verses 13 through 16, I think. There are maybe 4 verses.
No, that's right.
Where Jesus says, when your brother has sinned against you, the word is hamartano. He has hamartano is the verb. To sin is to miss the mark or to break something. It's not this horrific issue of guilt and shame and evil. It is something went wrong and your brother did that. Then go to him privately and talk to him one-on-one. If he won't listen to you, go with 1 or 2 others. Don't get on the phone, start, yapping to everybody you know. Take 1 or 2 others, go and talk to him. If he still won't listen to you, bring it before the church. And if he won't listen to the whole church, then treat him as scripture says, tax collector, or as a Gentile, an outsider. Right. And the question raised in my mind immediately is, so how did Jesus treat Gentiles and tax collectors? He made them his friends. He went to their house and had dinner.
Right.
It's usually taken as ostracize them, cut them off, have nothing to do with them. And it's like, okay, this went wrong. How about that? But Matthew 18, the protocol of Matthew 18, go by 1, go by 2 or 3, go before the whole church, is really about recreating community within a damaged situation.
Exactly.
It's not about winning the argument.
Exactly.
But it's not used that way. So the Matthew 18 protocol is usually, I'm going to whack the person. And if they won't respond to my determination, then I'm going to spread this all over the place and ruin their reputation. I'll get mine. And that's really the problem that arises in the Matthew 18 protocol. When Jesus talks about forgiveness, Peter says to him, how many times am I supposed to forgive my brother? 7 times, which was in the standard of 1 week. And Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. There's no end to the amount of time you forgive. So go back to Matthew 18. Your brother sins against you, forgive him. So what?
Right.
Forgiveness is actually a gift given to yourself. It's not
Right.
permission given to the other person, to the offender. Forgiveness says, I'm off the hook of this.
Right.
But most people don't see forgiveness. They see it as that way. They see it as giving permission or letting an offender off the hook. I'm not saying let him off the hook, but the issue is release yourself
Right.
from the penalty of this situation. But that's a Matthew 18. That's what you're talking about, is that protocol of 1, then 2 or 3, then take it.
Right. And that whole context, though, is that, again, as you talked about in a relationship or what happened to you, is that, well, the reason we're doing this is for the common good.
Right.
And it's like, well, wait a minute. How does destroying somebody's reputation is okay for the common good? I mean, those are the questions that come to mind.
Correct. And it actually enhanced my reputation as a troublemaker, rabble rouser, independent thinker, who's not afraid to say whatever. So it's like, in one circle, it was to ruin my reputation. And the actual result was that actually helped my reputation, because that's the reputation I want to have. So to me, the very thing they spoke of as evil, I said was good. I thought it was great.
Well, just so the record is clear, I never needed that to happen for me, that to enhance your reputation of the kind of person you are. I've always known you were a rebel, and and all those things. So
what's interesting to me is how many people communicated with me either during or after that in the last, that was 20 years ago, that have communicated with me in that time period, who said, I would have done that, but they shut me down. So my question to them was, how did they shut you down? And my superintendent, or my person of authority, said, you're going to lose your job if you don't stop this behavior. So I stopped. And it's like, well, that's interesting. Maybe way back when I was probably 12 or 13 years old, I worked in a Jewish delicatessen separating chicken parts out of 90-pound boxes. I was paid the typical minimum wage at that time, like $1.50 an hour. Hey, whatever it was cheap. But I also had a paper route, and I also did caddying at our golf course during the summer times. And I saved my money. I didn't spend everything that I had. I saved my money. So when I was dealing with the Jewish owner, and I'm Jewish too, so I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm really pro-Semitic. When he was ornery to everybody, I would stand up to him. He'd actually soften, but the other employees just wilted under his vociferous leadership style. He just seemed to want to commandeer and destroy everybody's sense of self-worth. And I didn't care, because I had pontoons for my boat. Shoot a hole in the bottom of my boat, water will come in, but I'm not going to sink because I have pontoons. And so the idea of always having a way of being sure that my preservation was insured was very important to me. So while I was a pastor, I wrote books. I opened a publishing company, so I owned the intellectual property. I also started a sign company. I had a restaurant business for a while with my son. We learned all kinds of skills. And so when one opportunity ended or was under threat, that was not enough to regulate, so to speak, my behavior, because I had options. And so that becomes one of the questions, is even developing options part of the conflict? because I could say anything I wanted to say that popped into my head. It was usually after a great deal of research. It wasn't just mouthing off. But I had no fear in doing that, because even in worst case scenario, I lose my job for a professional who's got 25 years in a company. That is big. That is really, really big. But I had options that I could fall back on, that we didn't miss a beat. We just went right on, that we were okay. So even that safety net was a part of the problem. They knew that if they fired me, I wouldn't see that as the end all of my life. I would still go on.
And I believe that when we come back to this whole concept of the challenging of the common good, when the common good really isn't the common good, from the standpoint of where you're challenging that because you can see a picture that's much bigger, but really what's going on is a lot of self-promotion, self-marketing, fear mongering, control, all those pieces that are quite frankly so much of the American church right now, of developing your own tribe. When when I mean, even the training, I mean, they won't come right out and say it in very real senses, but even the training that's been going on for several years, particularly with church planting and all that stuff, is that you need a homogeneous group of people, because that will grow your church much faster. If you have people, the birds of the feather will flock together kind of stuff. And you can say, well, that's for the common good. Well, is that really the common good when you're talking about really what the gospel is meant to be? That and the concept of the understanding that it's to all peoples. It's not just to the in group. But
the challenge with that is, if an organization, a local organization, ends up with a huge amount of friction and brokenness because they're not homogeneous on whatever the topic is. They don't have the same wealth or the same color or the same background, or whatever it has to be. Whatever makes the group homogeneous, having the birds of a feather. The challenge then is, if, let's say, 5 congregations in there, one is Hispanic, one is African American, one is white upper class, one is white lower class, one is hodgepodge of losers that nobody else wants. So you have 5 congregations, and you say the church, the big umbrella, is reaching the whole community. We have a common good. If you want to use the men's restroom, use the men's restroom. If you want the women's restroom, use the women's restroom. If you want to go to the rich white people's church, go to that church. If you want to go to the Hispanic church, the problem is, if we take the big picture, we say we do have the common good, while each individual locale required to actually be the common good across the board. And who decides that? I think the interesting question for me is when Paul makes the comment, the Spirit has been given to each person for a common good. The word is symphoron in Greek, and it's actually a business term. It's not a religious word. We're going to end in 10 minutes. Okay. The symphoron is a business term, meaning everyone benefits equally. The payday is distributed and everyone has the share. And so that becomes one of the questions in developing power structures in human organizations. One of my theories is, you get 2 human beings together or more, any number above that, 2 or more, you're going to have a power issue. Somebody's the leader, someone's in control, someone is responsive and follows that control. So if you have that, how is a common good developed across the board. And that becomes really the operative question today, and we're not answering it. We're only raising the question. We might
Right.
get onto this next week as well, because there's no easy answer.
Right. And I would say that that's where we probably could stop right here and keep going next week and talking about this, because I want to come back to your big umbrella mindset and what that looks like, and how I will challenge that because of well, what's it supposed to look like? Because I think that there's a dynamic that's gone on in the church in the last 50 years that has changed it greatly, in how we actually reach out to people within our sphere of influence.
And not only how, but why. Why do we reach out to those people?
Right.
And that becomes a huge question as well.
So we'll come back to that next week, since you wrote that down on your notes for us.
Yeah, more on the common good. This is really and for everybody who's listening to this, don't just listen to Myke and Mike blather on about stuff that doesn't matter. In your family, in your circles, the business you work in, the church you go to, or synagogue, or whatever it happens to be, ask the questions about, how does power flow in my unit? And why does it flow that way? Why do parents always give orders to their kids, but kids can't give orders to their parents? And on and on and on. Why is when in Acts chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas get called to Jerusalem to answer for their leading people to Jesus, but not requiring them to be Gentiles, they have to appear before the apostles and the elders. Who made them the top dogs that demand answers? I mean, it's like, where did that come from? And so understanding the flow of power and asking a question like, here's a common good. Why is that a common good?
Right.
That's really what we're struggling to discuss. So,
all right, we'll talk about it next week. This is West Coast Mike.
East Coast Mike, struggling to try and figure out some big ideas. Let's go to the pub and have a beer.
All right, we can do that. See us at grippingreality.com. The Myke and Mike, either one of us, and we would love to chat with you. So
by the way, my beer is going to be root beer because I don't drink beer.